Right, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure, on behalf of the Saïd Business School, to welcome Clay Christensen to his third lecture. I'm Richard Whittington, a member of the strategy faculty here. Clay's introduced the notion of disruption and applied it at the level both of firm and nation in this first lecture. Yesterday he talked or introduced the concept of the panda's thumb in organizations, evolutionary hangovers whose purpose one has completely forgotten, and I thought of Oxford University and some of its features when he talked about that. In each lecture he has been provocative, stimulating and fun, and this final lecture he's promised to talk about, amongst other things, the lunacy of certain kinds of academic research. So I think we can look forward to more provocation and more fun, and with that I shall hand over to Clay.
Well, you're robust to stay with us this long. I'm ashamed to say that this talk is completely new to me. I had talked publicly about some of the ideas last night, but this one is completely new to me. And as a general rule, the first time I give a talk, I really do a crummy job. And then I can learn from that. In the fourth group, then I'm really good at it. So thanks for being my guinea pigs for this one. But I thought what I would do is, rather than describe theories as nouns, I want to describe theories as verbs and try to get at some level of depth the process by which the theory of disruption coalesced and emerged from my research over the course of about 20 years. And the reason I thought it might be useful if I went through the process, and I'm still in the verb process, is that for those of you who are doing research, this might be useful to you. And for those of you who don't think you're in the business of developing theory, I want you to reconsider that. Because even if you plan to just get a bachelor's or master's in management and then go off and conquer the world, every time you try to learn from your own experience, you're developing a theory. And I hope that by going through this, even those of you who are not going to be academic researchers, but you're going to be the developer of theories from your own experience, that you'll be able to do this in a way that these theories, that you're learning the right lessons from your own experience. So I've described here the process of developing a theory as funnels that narrow in the middle. And I'd just like to go through it in abstract first, and then describe how the development of the theory of disruption emerged. So on the left, to start out, basically you have no option except to look at the phenomena. And the more phenomena you look at, the stronger your outcomes will be. And that's why I call it a big N. The result of this, just trying to get the data, if you're lucky, you'll develop constructs. And a construct is just a way to simplify things so that you can understand what the phenomena really are. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute. Then, because there's so much phenomena, you really have to quickly categorize things by the most salient characteristics. And so in business, this might be, the characterization might be publicly traded versus privately traded, high tech versus low tech, services versus products, and so on. And then you try to correlate the boundaries of these categories with the outcomes of interest. And so by the time you've made to the third stage, you've got this word correlation. And as we talked about in the first couple of our sessions together, especially the discussion about jobs to be done, there's a big difference between understanding what is correlated with the outcome versus what causes it. And at this point, we just have correlation. But if it's a strong or robust correlation, then you'll take that and go back and look at other phenomena. And you can predict, if this is a good correlation, what you're going to see. And if, in fact, you see what you predicted you'd see, you might feel good as a researcher. But if really what you're trying to do is develop good theory, you hope that you don't predict what you're going to see, because it's only if you see stuff that this can't account for, that this cannot account for, that you can improve it. And so what you really hope is that when you try to use this to predict this, that in fact you see an anomaly. Because if you see an anomaly, it causes you to go into the second stage and essentially say, we got the categories wrong. There's something else going on here. And I hope that you'll see in a minute why getting the categories right is so critical. And so as you keep doing this process and identifying anomalies that the association couldn't account for, you just make it sharper and sharper. And then there's an N of 1, meaning a deep study of one subject. And in this study, it helps you to get beyond what is correlated with what causes it to happen. And once you know what causes something to happen, then you move forward by using this statement of causality and say, all right, if that's what causes things to happen, I'm going to do stuff in that belief. But then again, what you hope is as you use it, that you find anomalies. In other words, you use the theory and it's wrong. Or you use the theory and you fail or you crash. Because if you find something again that doesn't result in success, it allows you to go back in and say, wait a minute, there must be something about the situation they were in that caused this causal mechanism not to result in success. And so you categorize it again, but now instead of categorizing the world by the characteristics of the phenomena, you categorize the world by the different situations in which you would find yourself. So a way to visualize it is, I'd like to go back to the Middle Ages when people were trying to learn how to fly. And the questions were, can mankind fly? If so, how? And we don't see this in the history, but this was an issue that obsessed tens of thousands of researchers. And so what they did was they just observed the phenomena and then categorized it. So they saw that most creatures could not fly and a few could. And the ones that could fly had wings and feathers, and those that couldn't fly didn't. Now there were anomalies to this. So ostriches had wings and feathers and they couldn't fly, and bats had wings with no feathers and they could fly very well, and flying squirrels had neither and they got by. But when they did the regressions and looked at the R-squareds, the R-squareds was so strong that they decided that man might be able to fly if they fabricated wings, stick feathers on them, strapped them onto their arms, and then went to the edge of cliffs or went up to cathedral spires and jumped off and flapped real hard. It turned out it never worked. And so that was an anomaly. And so people for centuries just framed the question as, well, those idiots just had bad wing designs, or they didn't flap hard enough, or they just didn't bulk enough up. And so they tried to solve the problem by improving on each of those dimensions, but it just never worked. And then Bacon wrote a very influential article in 1285, where his message was, ladies and gentlemen, you've got the categories wrong. The ones that can't fly have solid bones, and the ones that can fly have hollow bones. And unfortunately, mankind, we have solid bones, therefore we can't fly. And so Bacon gave us diagrams of machines that we have to construct where the machine would flap the wings and we might be able to fly. And of course, you've probably seen those diagrams, but that never worked either, because there was a correlation between the possession of wings and the ability to fly. But it really wasn't until Daniel Bernoulli, with his perspective of fluid mechanics, looked at one bird and figured out it's not just birds per se, or feathers or wings per se, but it's the shape that matters. And we call it now an airfoil. And if you run air against that airfoil, it creates a push against it. And that's the causal mechanism behind flight. And once he had done that through that N of 1, then people very quickly started around trying to develop machines that could harness this airfoil and fly. And it took a couple hundred years for people to figure out how to build these machines that would fly, and some of the first were the Wright brothers. But what happened is they would crash. And from the point of view of a researcher, a crash is a wonderful thing, because it allows you to go back and say, you know, it's not that deity canceled Bernoulli's principle on that particular day, but rather the question is, I wonder what it was about the situation that Pilate found herself in that caused Bernoulli's principle result in failure, not flight. And once you understood what the situations that they were in, by examining case by case the failure, it allowed researchers then to be able to state statements about this and then. So if you find yourself in this situation, pilots, these are the rules you got to follow. But if you find yourself in this situation, buddy, don't follow those rules because they don't work. You have to follow these rules. And if you find yourself ever in this situation, take my word for it, don't even try, because it's impossible. And so Bernoulli's principle helped us understand what caused the outcomes of interest. But then it wasn't until you had the tortuous study of what was it about the situations that caused it to fail or not to fail. And so this made it plausible. This made life or flying predictable. And once you then could make statements about if-then, that enabled accurate precision, broad applicability, and deep explanatory power. And that's what you really hope for in a theory. I've described that several times in the last 2 lectures as a theory is a statement of what causes what and why. And all I'm trying to do here is just to give a little bit more deeper description of what we mean by a theory and why it's so important. And again, if you have time over the next several days, try to put those things through there and think about your own personal experience. And where are you and what are you learning? And are you learning the right things from your own experience? So now what I'd like to do with that in place, here's a summary of it. So in essence, what we're trying to do is try to get the essence of the phenomena, which we call constructs, and I'll define that in just a minute. And then we have to narrow the phenomena into categories, distill relationships, which are correlations, and then we jump across, and now we have a very simple explanation of what causes it, now what situations you might find yourself in, and then you can guide your path into the future with these if-then statements. All right. So, the theory of disruption. This began when I was a graduate student in 1990, which I was 40 at the time. I was 38 at the time. And that was just last year. And what I did was I built a census of the disk drive industry. And I was very lucky to have come across an industry where there was an organization called Disk Trend Report, and it had collected every disk drive company that ever had been organized, whether they had ever shipped a product or not. And the data showed what their revenues were, what their market share was, and it listed all of the products that they designed, and every component in every model that they designed. And so it wasn't a sample of the industry, it truly was a consensus, or a census of the disk drive industry. And I'd like to talk just for a second about the nature of what it turned out to be. It was a case, but at one level, the case was the history of the disk drive industry. But inside of the case of the industry, it was a case about companies within the industry. And that was a case. And then within the companies, I studied projects that developed disk drives. And so that was a case within a case within a case. And then inside of the teams that developed these products, there were individuals. And every individual was a case within a case within a case within a case. And then each side of every individual, there were their brains. And I tried to understand how these guys were thinking about these problems. And so it was a case within a case within a case within a case within a case. And they were, a better word for it, is these cases were nested one with another. And one of the things that bothers me about academia sometimes is that people disparage the study by the case method. And I don't think we ought to worry about that, because at any level, it's a case. And then the second thing I'd like to say, looking back on it, is that a lot of the data was actually taken from financial reports that these companies delivered if they were publicly traded, and if not, they gave it to their private equity backers. And when you look at a number of cost in a financial statement, it'd be interesting if you would do this. Just take that number, and if you have an X-Acto knife, just open the cover off of the number and look inside. Holy cow, it's horrific. Because where that number came from is there are some direct costs that are clearly and unambiguously measured and attributed to the cost of that product. But then you have overhead costs. And the magnitude of the overhead costs in a number about cost is generally 3 to 5x bigger than the direct cost. And when you look at this inside of this printed number, what you'll see is the way overhead is allocated to costs is the process of arguing, lying, negotiation, cheating, and a lot of worse words. And somehow, by that process, overhead allocations are attributable to particular products. And then they sew it up nicely, and they publish it as a number. And in academia, we look at these numbers, and people who love to manipulate numbers, they call this hard data. And people who do case-based research, where they interview people and get what they call subjective data, somehow we don't accord the same legitimacy to subjective data as we do hard data. But in reality, the nice thing about subjective data is that we open up for everybody to examine the subjectivity associated with that number. And hard data covers up the subjectivity. And so I don't think that as researchers that we ought to have any disparaging words in one direction or another, because all data is subjective. It's all soft. It's just the question of which is open for a public display. So I just wanted to say that about the nature of the data, and I just hope that we can all be humble about the nature of whatever it is we have to work for. Here, the result is a construct. And an example in my research of the construct where there are these trajectories. One is a trajectory of improvement that innovating companies provide, and the other is a trajectory of improvement that customers can utilize. And you don't see any trajectories in the air around us, do you? Because these are constructs. An abstraction that helps us understand a lot more than if we were just buried in all of the phenomena. And I observed, not only do we have these these trajectories in this industry, but this one went up faster than this one. And so that happened in about 1990. It took about 6 months to figure that out. And thank goodness I didn't pay a graduate research assistant to put the data in to my computer. I put it in myself with some help from my kids. But had I not put it in myself, I don't think I would have had the feel for what the data was saying. Then the next that came up with about a year later was this idea that instead of there being individual trajectories, there are actually tiers in the market. And this one could be undercut by this one. And so the whole idea of disruptive and sustaining inventory came from a realization that the whole industry isn't on one of these trajectories, but somebody could come in above them or below them. And then when I looked at what happened to them, I realized that people who came in on the lower trajectory did better. And I put up here an anomaly to Henderson, just to remind me. There's a wonderful member of our faculty named Rebecca Henderson who did one of these a couple of years ago. And she had done a study of the lithographic industry, where she decided that the ones that won and the ones that lost, it was driven by the complexity of a new architecture in the product. And it turned out, and it was widely cited, it turned out as I did this work and tried to see could her explanation describe what was happening in disk drives, in fact, she was wrong. And I owe so much to the fact that she was able to, she went in front of me, developed something, and then when I said, Rebecca, I don't think your explanation accounts for this, she was so gracious to say, you're right. And that allowed me, thankfully, to say, Rebecca, thank you. Because I would never have been able to come up with this had she not been the pioneer. And then realize that what she did when I found an anomaly to hers was to say, boy, take it from there. And without her graciousness, I don't know that I would have been able to succeed, because she then worked with me to keep pushing the theory ahead. And she viewed it, the enterprise is to develop theories, not to develop personal careers. And she subsequently has had a marvelous career, as you know. And then by 1992, which is the year when I got my doctorate, in my thesis, all I could say was there's a correlation between trying to build a company that is disruptive versus the probability of success if you build it on a sustaining innovation. And so what I said is, if you start here competing head-on with the existing customers, the probability that you'll succeed is 8%, 6%. And if you come down and have a lower cost product, the probability of success was 35%. So at this point, it truly was a correlation between success and your position on this trajectory. Well, what I did next was I stayed for the next 5 or 6 years on the left-hand side of this diagram. And the question was, where else do we see this? And because I was born where I was born and when I was born, in 1962, there was what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there was just almost a panic in America that we were going to have a nuclear war with the Russians over Cuba. And there was just such a frenzy about this almost, that there were a lot of people, including our next door neighbor, who built bomb shelters in their home or in their backyard. And I remember when our neighbors decided to do a bomb shelter, this is the kind of excavator they brought into their backyard. And you notice, we called them steam shovels, and you notice that it made the hole by pulling up this way. And when I was in this research, I thought, you don't see these anymore. But instead, you see excavators that reach out this way and pull it in. And so it turns out that our neighbor was a contractor, an excavator contractor. His profession was to dig holes. And so I went over these two things, these photos to him, and I said, I described this diagram that occurred in the disk drive industry, and I said, is this diagram help in any way describe how these guys are extinct and they were supplanted by hydraulic excavators? And he said, absolutely, it's exactly what happened. And he showed me a photograph of the early hydraulic excavator that was stuck on the back of a farm tractor. And he said, it's exactly what happened. These guys could only lift a quarter yard of earth. This one could pull 8 cubic yards of earth. And so these are all new companies, and the technology just got better and better and better until it cleaned them out. Anyway, so I said, is there any data about this industry? Because I wanted, again, to have a census of the hydraulic excavator industry. And my neighbor said, yeah, I belong to an association of excavating companies. And once a year, a lot of us have antique excavators. And we find someplace in the Midwest where it's flat. And we all drive our excavators to this place. And for 2 weeks, we dig holes and pull it up and stick it over here. And then we take it from here and put it back there. And then we go home. And he said, there's this guy, he's a nutsy guy. His name is Mr. Toth, I can't remember his first name, that is the historian for the Excavator Association of America. And I bet he's got data on this. Anyway, so I called him up, and he lived in Pontiac, Michigan, and was a worker on an assembly line of Pontiac cars. And I explained what he did, and he said, boy, do I have data for you. Why don't you come? Here's my address. And so I came in one evening, and his mother, he was like 50 years old and had never been married, and his mother had made dinner for me and said, we want you to sleep in this bedroom. And then he took me to the basement, and holy cow, around the basement, all around the periphery, were these cabinets, and inside was the brochure for every excavating company, product that had been ever made from 1920 to the present. Holy cow. And I don't know why I was so lucky, but I stayed down there in the basement while he went off to assemble Pontiacs for about 4 days, and had this all down then in my computer. And my gosh, the very same thing happened in that industry too. And so seeing that this happened in disk drives and excavators, I then thought, I want to try to go around the periphery of the whole world and see if this is happening in industries that are all very different from each other, thinking that if I stake up the trajectory, that everybody will believe that this is an applicable theory to every situation. And so I had done those two. We applied it to discount retailing versus traditional retailing, steel, motor controls, diabetes care, computers, electronic automobiles. And I thought, man, when I have studied all of these different types of industries where this phenomenon happens, surely people will believe me. And instead of believing me, they all came back with, well, wait a minute. Does this apply to ERP software like SAP? And another one says, does this apply to Germany? And the killer was somebody who was an engineer from the disk drive industry said, look, clearly it worked, it explains the past, but does it predict the future? And I said, well, the problem with the future is there's no data about the future yet. Anyway, so out of all of this, I just got the realization that if I think that I can establish the validity of this work by just applying it over and over and over again, I will never get there. And you can't play in that game forever. And that's when I realized that I needed to figure out what caused it to happen. And at the time, I was writing The Innovator's Dilemma, and there was an article written by Solanchik and Peffer, where from their perspective, the explanation was, you're captive to your customers. If you develop products that your customers buy, they then provide you with the money to stay in the business. But if you don't develop products that your customers want to buy, they won't give you any money and you'll fail. And therefore, your customers really dictate what you can and cannot do. And that was essentially the model of these guys that they published about a decade before I did my work. And so if you read back The Innovator's Dilemma, that's the explanation of what causes it to happen. And then a guy who I knew, but without any conversation with me, wrote a paper and published it in which he wrote a mathematical model of the phenomena of disruption. And as you know, when you do this stuff mathematically rather than in verbiage, sometimes the math makes you much more explicit about the assumptions that you're making and what causes what and why. And my brain can't think in terms of math, and so I just couldn't get there. But Ron, he was at INSEAD at the time, wrote this model, and what he observed is that it actually is the pursuit of profit that causes the leaders in the industry to get out and the disruptors to get in. And that just changed my life when he understood that the real fundamental reason for disruption is the pursuit of profit. Then I could see things in so much clearer terms than I could see when it was just, I could express things in terms of probabilities. And so I wrote the book, The Innovator's Solution, in which Ron's core insight was the essence of my description of the phenomena of disruption. And in a lot of ways, the first book, The Innovator's Dilemma, described the problem as best I understood it. And now this one, we're trying to get to what do you do about the problem. So we're getting, as you can see, a little bit closer here. Now, in order to get this body of understanding to here, we had to figure out, I couldn't build companies to see if they're succeeding and failing at the outset. So what we decided to do was to use the theory to predict what the result is going to be in the future of industries and companies. And then by projecting what's going to happen, we could then see whether or not we were right or wrong. So a couple of my MBA students hung around for a couple of years, and we wrote a book called Seeing What's Next. And under here it says, Using the Theories of Innovation to Predict Industry Change. And so we decided we would try to look into the future of 6 industries. And again, we tried to have them different from each other and essentially write the history before the history happened. And so we stuck our necks out to get taken off. And it turned out that in these 4, telecoms, semiconductors, healthcare, and emerging markets, we got the history just right, long before the history happened. And our assessment of aviation and education, we were totally wrong. But the great thing about being wrong, and we were being wrong in public, is that it caused us to go back and essentially say there's something else going wrong. And for the aviation industry in particular, it was very helpful because we had just simplistically thought that low-cost air companies are going to disrupt the traditional airline companies. And it didn't always happen. And I just couldn't think, and what did upmarket mean? You can go from economy to first class, but how do you go up from first class? It didn't make any sense. And then one day at home, I got my frequent flyer report from Delta Airlines. And what it showed is that Delta, in the last quarter, had added 8 new routes. And I looked at what they were, and they were Atlanta to Budapest, Atlanta to Buenos Aires, Dallas to Singapore. These are long, luscious routes. And then underneath it, they had added 31 routes that were not run by Delta, but by Delta Express that was operated by SkyWest and other regional companies. And these were short routes. But I looked at who they added, and originally what I thought was a short route would be Salt Lake City to Idaho Falls. But now they were adding Salt Lake City to San Diego and Atlanta to St. Louis. And what happened, what we realized, is that rather than the vertical axis be quality, was the case with the steel industry, whatever at the top is what is more profitable, and whatever is at the bottom is less profitable. And for the airline industry, long routes were more profitable, and short routes were less profitable. And so the two companies, the low-cost entrants that became successful were Southwest in America and Ryanair in Britain, because they started with short routes. And these guys, as they're trying to offer longer and longer routes, they're quite happy to give away to Southwest and Ryanair longer and longer routes. And so this phenomena happened once I got the categories right. And so again, thank goodness we got it wrong, because now we could get it right. And you can apply this in unbelievably useful ways into the financial industry, for example. Because the vertical axis is high net worth customers are much more profitable than clients that have fewer assets. And bigger loans are bigger than smaller loans. And big deals are more attractive than small deals. And when you could describe it in that way, you could see how the leaders were just getting blown out of the water by people coming beneath them. In America, just as an example, in the debt industry, a company called Capital One came in at the bottom of the market, and they had an algorithm by which they could give small amounts of loans to individual people. And the big New York banks were just happy to give the small customers away, and one by one, the New York banks got out of the consumer business. And the last one to hang on was Citibank, and they just gave out, they got rid of their consumer business about 3 years ago. And these guys are all going after bigger and bigger deals with bigger and bigger corporations. And then they find that there's not enough oxygen up there to support all of them. And so in New York, Bankers Trust went out of business, and then Chemical merged with Manny Hanny, which merged with Chase, which merged with J.P. Morgan. And what you see happening is these guys go after bigger and bigger and bigger companies, and these guys consolidate and lay people off. But we were able, because we got aviation wrong, we were able then to expand the theory in a much more useful way. Then another thing that we did to get these, what are the different situations that you find yourself in my MBA class, every day to prepare for the class, we asked them to come to class not just having studied the theory that we'll use to examine the case that day, but their assignment is to come to class with an anomaly. In other words, there's something that they have seen that Clay's theory can't account for. And about 5 years ago, one of the students said, Clay, this doesn't happen in hotels. And I never had thought about hotels before. But he said what happens in hotels is like the Holiday Inn. Did I talk about this? Yeah. Holiday Inn came in the 1950s in America with crummy low-end hotels. And for reasons we can understand, the nice hotels didn't come to squish Holiday Inn, but Holiday Inn has not been able to go up market. And McDonald's comes in with cheap food, and for reasons we can understand, nice restaurants haven't come down to kill them, but McDonald's hasn't been able to move up to speak of. And why is it that disruption doesn't happen in hotels or restaurants? And this is a great anomaly, and it took us 5 years to figure out what's going on. And what we realized is that, in fact, there's a categorization scheme. And so there's one situation in an industry where there is what we call the technological core. And that is that there's something about the business model or the technology which at the beginning can only do simple products or services, but this technological core can be extended up market to do more and more sophisticated things. So, for example, you remember the description of how the mini mills killed the integrated steel companies. The extendable core was the electric furnace. And at the beginning, because they were melting scrap, every day, that day's batch of scrap, they'd throw it in to the furnace, and it would melt it. And then when it came out, it was different every day because the inputs were different. And these guys figured out a technology which figuratively allowed them to stick their finger in the melted steel and pull it out and say, okay, we need about 2.3 tons of tin, and could you bring us 0.7 tons of nickel? And by their ability to measure the chemistry of the melt, it didn't matter what went in, what went out was exactly what they needed. And so that was the extendable core that allowed the mini mills go from rebar up to making sheet for cars. And so when you drive your car, I hope you think about this, that 60% of the steel in your car was melted, and it is perfect steel because of this extendable core. But then we realized that the hotels don't have an extendable core. So if Holiday Inn wants to go up market, they have to emulate what Four Seasons offers. They can't disrupt them. If Four Seasons has a nice concierge, then Holiday Inn have to emulate with offering the same, because there wasn't anything that brought a lower cost op. And what we've seen is that there are a lot of industries where there isn't a technological core. And so a company who wants to go up market can go up market, but they have to emulate the people that they want to compete against. They can't disrupt them. And this was very helpful, for example, when we started to look at the future of higher education, because historically there hasn't been any disruption of higher education. We just have better and better and better and more and more and more universities and colleges. But now online learning brings to higher education a technological core. And so what used to be undisruptible is now very disruptible. And thank goodness that our teachers, our students, were trying every day to find out something that Clay's theories can't account for. And then the last thing we did was we set up an investment company called Rose Park Advisors to invest in companies that we judged to be disruptive. And every time that team puts money into a company, they're taking the theory to a test that disruptive companies will yield higher returns than regular companies. And most of the time they do, and it was very successful. But occasionally they'd put money in, and it just was a blob, but that allowed us to figure out what are the different situations that you might find yourself in. And that then allows us to do the next step, which is make if-then statements. And what we found we could do is with these theories, in the same year, I don't say this to be proudful, but these two books about the future of healthcare and the future of why our schools struggle to improve, we wrote these two books in parallel. And people look at them, and both of them have received pretty much all of the awards in their categories. And they think, how in the world could you write two books on such totally different topics? And my answer is, they're not two totally different topics. Because what we have at our disposal is a set of theories. And understanding the theory is the enterprise. And these were just two applications of the same body of theory that allowed us then to be much more productive than otherwise would be the case. And so the last slide is a hodgepodge here of different theories from our research that have been built in this way, and I've tried to position them at where they are. And we use all of these theories in our course. So disruption, and another one that you should be happy you don't learn about is the law of conservation of modularity, have gone through this process, and they're very, in my mind, very reliable, that are filled with this-then statements. Then there's a set of things that are better than they used to be, but they still have a long way to go, and jobs to be done is here. And then there's a set of things that are in orange, just emerging, still very much in the phenomena stage. These two things are really not theories, but they are the process of strategy is a construct, and this is a framework, and they don't really mean that they're not amenable to becoming full theories. And then there are a few others that my colleagues have put in place that are turning out to be very useful. And I guess the last point is a friend of mine, Kent Bowen, who is a great scientist, once commented to me that great science simplifies. And this is not simple. But I think you have to go through a stage of complexity before things become simpler. And so what we have here are a set of theories that describe what happens to a manager in various dimensions of her life. And it's quite helpful, but there sure is a lot still to be done. So I thought maybe we could just stop. What I've just tried to do is summarize for you this process of developing theory that has taken essentially 20 years. But the process, I think, is quite robust in that what we're showing is taking a body of understanding piece by piece through the process and having reverence or respect for the process has been helped my colleagues and I be relatively productive in our research. And so I hope that that will help some of you who are in the middle of forming your research questions and so on to have a benefit of this experience. So what we could do is invite questions about the process of building theory, if you want. Do I have comments about other ways of doing theory in academia? Or you can throw questions to me, such as, should you go long or short on Apple stock? And what I'll try to provide in response is not Clay's opinion, but rather there are certain theories that have opinions about questions like Apple, and just show you how we can draw some of these theories to give our sense for what's going to happen. So I'll take any questions like that or more.